I'm going to talk to you with you for about 40 minutes this evening about something I think you probably know a lot about, but I'm going to give you another angle and bring you on a little journey that I took over the course of almost a decade of ethnographic research with mostly African-American consumers, and particularly in the early days of direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry testing. So like you, many of you, I was in 2002, 2003, interested in sort of small scattering of stories and some apocryphal stories I was hearing from people about what would be the emergence of the direct-to-consumer genetic testing industry in the United States. And in particular, some of these stories were suggesting that there might be a special role for this industry for African Americans. Could this be the sort of link that would help African Americans trace their roots to the continent of Africa in ways that had not been possible before the Human Genome Project and the kind of technologies and forms of analysis that that enabled? So in 2003, I began to try to answer this question. I was very much initially interested in the question of why people would do this testing. I mean, part of all of my work really is about the question of how communities of color, communities that have been in some ways the most sort of subjugated and victimized and often discriminated against in the realms of science and technology, come to use these same sites of knowledge and of power to do things in the world. Do things in the world like, have positive health-seeking behavior. Do things in the world like become doctors and scientists. And do things in the world like engage science and technology in their politics. So if I was going to do this study today, this research today, I could just do a survey. I could use maybe Amazon.com's Mechanical Turk. I could, email lots of people. I could use SurveyMonkey. There's a population now. I mean, the industry is estimated to be about $2 billion and $2 billion industry. And we know that there are millions of consumers today who have taken these tests. However, when I first started doing my research, there were very few people who even knew what genetic ancestry testing was. And so I found myself interested in this very cutting-edge technology, but I found myself having to go to the most conventional space, the most traditional and conservative space one can study genealogy, and to find the people who were the early adopters as we were making this turn from conventional genealogy to genetic genealogy. So I found myself at places like this. I became a member of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, and also a member of my local chapter in Harlem, New York. This is a photograph from the national meeting of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, which took place in Massachusetts. The gentleman in the foreground is an African-American geneticist named Jamie Wilson, who was at UMass Lowell and was doing a DNA 101 presentation to genealogists. He was trying to convince them, if you could imagine such a thing 10 years ago or more, about 10 years ago, that genetics could actually be useful for doing genealogical research. And with him is a genealogist, and what we might think about as genealogy cosplay. So I'm in Massachusetts, and he's dressed in colonial garb here. So these are some photographs, unless they say otherwise, these are photographs that I took during my research. So this is Dr. Jamie Wilson's DNA 101 seminar. I mean, they were literally passing around a double helix to sort of explain to genealogists what DNA was. Similar from the same DNA 101 seminar, and these are bits of construction paper that these genealogists are holding up that comprise the nucleotides, or that represent the nucleotides that comprise DNA. So a couple of things to say. I mean, over the last decade, genetic genealogy has gotten a lot younger. So the people that I was initially spending time with were what we call in the social work literature the ken keepers, right? So the ken keeper in your family is the one person you can call and in 10 minutes be caught up on all the divorces, all the babies, all the graduations, all the weddings, all the engagements, right? And that person is often the genealogist as well, the person who keeps the family records and these sorts of things. In my sample, they tended to be women who were 50 or older, although there are some men, as you will see, and they were often highly educated. So most of them had master's degrees. Many of them had worked in state and municipal government, so you could retire at 55 or 60 and have both leisure time and mobility and leisure income to do genealogy, to travel to archives, to do the work that genealogy requires. So I spent some of my time doing that, and then I found myself in places like this in 2007, where this is the Family History Library in Salt Lake City, Utah. So the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society en masse, about 2,000 of us African Americans, show up in Salt Lake City for our annual meeting. Those of you who have been in Salt Lake City know that that's a tremendous demographic shift for that city. And everyone knew why we were there, but you know, it was also incredible. Those of you who have ever been involved in genealogical communities know that our ability to do genealogy owes very much to the Latter-day Saint Church and the work that they've done to both collect and archive records, and they're a tremendous hope. They were tremendous hosts. I also spent time with my local chapter. The woman pictured here is a woman named Sharon Wilkins. This is the interior of the Harlem Latter-day Saints Church. Those of you who know Harlem will recognize, will know this building because Harlem is filled with churches, but this building stands out, the LDS Church, which is on the corner of 128th and Malcolm X Boulevard in Harlem. So we're there on this occasion for a Black History Month event in which they allowed members of the local community to come to the church. Mormons and African Americans, sometimes that's an intersecting set, galvanized around the idea that you don't know where you're going till you know where you've been, this sort of sense that genealogy and history tells us something about the future. So initially what I found, I told you I was interested in questions about why people would do this, given the sort of very vexed history of race and genetics in our country and in the world. And I was also interested, I think, in the shift in identity. How would people think, who would they think they are after they did these tests? So some of my early research in the first year or two didn't look entirely unlike shows that you're familiar with. These genetic genealogy, reality television shows that people, you know, that have these dramatic revelations of often conventional and genetic genealogy. Some of them as well didn't look too different from our friend Kyle here. So you'll recognize Kyle from this hokey Ancestry.com commercial where he talks to us about how for years and years he'd worn lederhosen, and then he got danced in a German troupe, and then he got his genetic ancestry testing, and now, as you see, he's wearing a kilt. So everything can change, you know, sartorially, dancing, and the like. So as a social scientist, though, and as a social scientist of a certain age, of an age that was a child when Roots came on television, when genealogy had an earlier moment as being a big American fad, I was actually really interested as I got into sort of year 4 and year 5 and year 6 of my research, why it was sticking around, right? Those of you who will remember this moment from the 1976, you know, Alex Haley's book, Roots, comes out in 1976, and the miniseries 1977. For me, it left an indelible mark because my parents were very strict, but this was one of the very first American miniseries. It ran for 8 days straight. It ran until 10 or 11 p.m., and me and my siblings were allowed to stay up to watch all of it in its entirety. Like, we were typically not allowed to watch TV, and certainly not that late. And it was a national phenomenon. For those of you who are younger, this was a time when we had 3 television stations where we watched television together as a nation. You couldn't binge watch or these sorts of things. So there were times, you know, in the 20th century where television really became part of a national discourse. And this was certainly one of those moments. But those of you who remember this time also remember there was kitsch that came with this. There were family tree coloring books, and there were things you could hang on the wall. Some of you will remember there were like make your own coat of arms. And then in 3 or 4 years, it was all over, right? We had the book was important, but we weren't really as a nation sort of totally enwrapped in the practice of genealogy in the same way. So I began to sort of step back as a scholar and sort of think, you know, what's going on here? Why is it sticky? If this other moment of genealogy went the way of the hula hoop, went the way of the Rubik's Cube, right, even though it had an important mark on American society, why is it that this other roots seeking, this other genealogy is sticking? So I stopped doing sort of Q&As with people, and I started to do a more sort of densely ethnographic project in which I just spent time trying to figure out what people thought the test could do in their lives and what they were trying to do with genetic ancestry testing results. So my book title, and also the subtitle from the Chicago Humanities Festival, comes from the anthropologist Arjuna Padurai's edited book from 1988 called The Social Life of Things, in which he tells us that the way that we can understand what material culture and other things in the world mean is by following their kind of social circulation. What do they do? How do they travel in the world? He was interested in talking about, forms of money and pots and these sorts of things that had a different kind of materiality, but I think that these hold true for other things in the world as well, things like DNA, which I will talk about, and certainly the social life of ideas, which bring us here today. So I began to sort of, as I said, spend different kinds of time with people who I was talking to. I just started hanging out with them instead of having my kind of protocol of questions. One of the groups of people that I spent time with were the descendants of a formerly enslaved man named Venture Smith, who died in 1805 in East Haddam, Connecticut. He's a very interesting figure for so many reasons. He buys himself out of slavery. He is an important historical figure in Connecticut. He would become a relatively wealthy man. And so he's an important historical figure in Connecticut. The state genealogist and the state historian have invested quite a lot of time and energy and sort of finding out about his background and uncovering his genealogy. I spent time with members of his family. These are some of his descendants who come every fall, typically in September, to a congregational church in Connecticut to commemorate his life and to lay a wreath on his tomb. So there's members of his family pictured here and here as well. So Venture Smith is interesting as well. This is why he's also an interesting figure, because he writes one of the few slave narratives that we have available to us. He also writes a smaller subset of slave narratives that traces his life back to the continent of Africa. So Venture Smith in his slave narrative of the life and adventures of Venture, a native of Africa, talks about his village on the continent of Africa, which historians think to be Guinea. He talks about his family, the village where he was living as a boy. He talks about the moment of capture, the Middle Passage journey to the Americas. He has for us the entire journey. So he tells his story to a local school teacher. And we know from that a lot of slave narratives where we have to account for the filter of the person who collected the story. But even accounting for this, historians, linguists really say that we have a fairly solid account of who Venture Smith was. He tells us his birth name was Brotier, and he was named Venture by his slaveholder. And so this family became particularly interesting to me. Because in 2006, they allowed researchers at the University of Connecticut and at the University of Hull in the UK to exhume his body, to do DNA analysis to tell us where he's from, right? So recall that we have, in Venture's own words, right, accounting for that filter of the school teacher, an account of where he's from that's been sort of verified and adjudicated by scholars. So I became curious in the question of what we think genetics can do, what we think genetics can tell us, genetic analysis, that a story effectively in a man's close to his own words, in addition to decades and decades of research about him, couldn't tell us. So I asked his family, who I had spent time with. He had two 8th generation descendants living. And one I asked, what do you think the DNA testing does? And she says, Alondra, I hope it will help school children. I think hope it will have some kind of educational, impulse. And then the second of his 8th generation descendants, a woman named Florence Wormsley, I asked the same question to her, and she's pictured here. And she said, I want it to bring healing. So this was one of the moments where I thought, okay, so these tests just aren't about identity. People think that they can do something in the world, that the knowledge of the past can do something around healing, around reconciliation. and I'm going to tell you tonight about some of these projects that I call reconciliation projects. So I came to think of genetic ancestry testing as playing, to answer the question about why is it sticky, right, after the kind of fad moment of, spit parties and these sorts of things descend. Because I came to think of genetic ancestry testing as it's used in the United States as part of a larger sort of world historical practice in which genetic analysis is being put to the work of answering all sorts of questions, resolving all sorts of controversies in the social and political world. So we might think of the grandmothers of the May Plaza in Argentina after the authoritarian regime there is disbanded. These are grandmothers pictured here. This is Mary Claire King, who's the University of Washington geneticist, pictured here with two of the grandmothers, who suspected that this authoritarian regime had disappeared their grandchildren, right? They had, many of their children were left activists and they were disappeared. We now know that women who were pregnant were brought to camps where they gave birth to their children, and the children were placed in the homes of allies of the authoritarian regime. And these activist women, some pictured here as well, sought to find their grandchildren. So they go to Mary Claire King, and initially they use blood antigen testing, HLA testing, and later they would use early genetic testing in the 1980s to relocate their families. And for a time, the project of the grandmothers of the May Plaza would become part of a project of the nation state around reconciliation in the nation state of Argentina, doing the work of locating these children. So in my project, I'm particularly interested in what we might think of as a subset of these larger reconciliation projects. In the social science literature, sometimes this work is also called humanitarian DNA, endeavors to use genetic analysis variously in lots of different social and political projects. And I became particularly interested in the use of genetic testing and genetic analysis to endeavor to resolve or say something about the history of racial slavery in the United States. So recall that some of the very first papers and the use of the kind of post-human genome genetics around social issues in the United States are not like in the UK, in which the University of Oxford geneticist Brian Sykes, who in recent years has got a bit kooky, but in his earlier years, was using genetic analysis to help solve mysteries around the last Tsarina. Was this woman who claimed to be, the family, the last descendant of the Russian royal family, truly who that was, and other kinds of sort of solving other kinds of mysteries with regard to European history. In the United States, one of the first endeavors to use genetic analysis around social and historical issues is around slavery. It's this important 1998 paper in Nature, Jefferson Fathered Slave/Child, right? So the story of a founding father and of Jefferson and Sally Hemings sit at the very center of the first kind of extra medical, outside of medical, clinical uses of genetics in the US. So we can talk more about this paper and the sort of controversy around it, but I just want to sort of sit that there for now and move on. So to go back to one of the questions I raised early on. Okay, so African Americans want to know what their genetic ancestry is. They want to know, we want to know what our pre-Middle Passage identities are. But how do we get around that piece about the history of scientific racism and of that piece about the fact that genetics has not been a friend to many communities, African Americans and others? So to think about this piece, again, I was continuing to sort of study people and follow people who were involved in the story that I was trying to trace rather than just asking them before and after questions about their identity. So I come to follow early in my project an African-American geneticist named Rick Kittles. I actually met him here in Chicago when he was on the faculty of UIC, and who would later start a company called African Ancestry. But before he starts this company, he's a junior researcher when he's finishing his PhD in genetics at George Washington University on the African Burial Ground Project in Lower Manhattan. So some of you will recall that in 1991, the federal government plans in Lower Manhattan to put up a General Services Administration building that would hold local offices of the IRS and other kinds of federal entities. Where they plan to put this building, there are some historical maps that suggest that it either abuts or is quite adjacent to what was called the Negroes' burying ground. So I'm a Californian, and as a Californian, you can hardly put a shovel in your backyard without having a whole kind of cultural resource management team, including an indigenous observer, come to make sure you're not destroying any natural history. So the fact that we could think that we were next to or even on top of a cemetery and would still proceed was always shocking to me. So you won't be surprised to hear that what starts as a construction site becomes an excavation site because it was indeed a cemetery. The African Burial Ground Research Project was first analyzed by the Metropolitan Forensic Anthropology team at Lehman College, which is part of the City University of New York set of campuses. And this MFAT laboratory, as it's called at Lehman College, trained sort of CSI technicians, right? They're not academic archaeologists, academic biological anthropologists, and they weren't particularly interested in the historical significance or the social significance of these remains, which were anticipated to be the largest cemetery or the largest burying ground and remains of formerly enslaved Africans and enslaved colonial New Yorkers. So there's lots of controversy around the site. There's controversy because there are groups of New Yorkers who call themselves the descendants of the African burial ground, right? We don't know who's buried there yet, so this is a political claim people are making about who should be in charge of the disposition of the remains. Say that this lab should not be working on these remains because this lab is interested in things like, is this a Negroid or a Mongoloid femur? How many centimeters is it? How much does it weigh? They weren't interested in the sort of rich cultural history that these activists thought could be that the cemetery, this burial ground, might be able to provide us. So they contact African-American physical anthropologist named Michael Blakey, who was then at Howard University. And Blakey takes a look and he said, Lehman College's methodology reduced the individuals in the burial to narrow typologies and thinly descriptive variables that disassociated them from their culture or history. So what Blakey and other scientists and social scientists who were galvanizing around the site and around a different kind of research strategy were suggesting is that there was a kind of race-making work to what the Lehman College Laboratory might be doing, and that this burial ground could offer so much more. It could tell us were families buried together, were people buried segregated by gender, were they buried in a style that suggested they practice Islam, were they buried with cowrie shells or other forms of material culture that would tell us something about from where they'd come, right? So not just this kind of gross classification. Moreover, this group that called themselves, as I mentioned, the descendants of the African burial ground, actually said that what the Lehman College lab was doing amounted to the biological racing of their ancestors' bodies, right? They claimed that they were opposed to merely descriptive frameworks that would, quote, reduce their ancestors' social identities to skin color. So this is the sort of thin line that members of the African American community are walking around race and genetics. And this is how they understood, and I think one of the ways why genetic ancestry testing is one of the reasons why it's able to sort of capture the imagination of members of the African American community despite the history of scientific racism. So the remains, there's lots of controversy at the site. The remains are moved from Lehman College to Howard University, where Michael Blakey is. They're moved to the Montague Cobb Laboratory at Howard University. Montague Cobb was an African-American physical anthropologist who was also a part of the NAACP, and in the 20th century wrote a column called the Integration Battlefront, in which he often railed against scientific racism and used his expertise as a scientist to do his own particular work around anti-racism as a member of the NAACP. So moving the project from Lehman to college to Howard University at the Cobb Laboratory also moved it into a different kind of political project, as well as a different kind of research project. So at Howard University, they do what they call a biocultural interdisciplinary research strategy that includes archaeology, history, dental morphology, as well as in some other contexts, which you might think of as exhibit A and B of scientific racism, right? Craniometry and molecular genetics. The molecular genetics is done by Rick Kittles, the junior scientist working on the team, among others. But what the activists were saying and what the scientists were saying is that it's not the technique, it's the heuristic. It's the analytical frame that you use around the technique. So this was one of the moments that helped me to kind of understand how communities that are otherwise known to be distrustful of science and technology, particularly genetic science, were able to understand how genetics might be useful for their political and social interests. Indeed, Michael Blakey, at an earlier moment in the project, would suggest that the use of genetic analysis of the remains and of the use of these forms of biocultural interdisciplinary scientific investigation were part of another dimension of a long-standing human rights struggle in African American communities, the struggle to know and to find origins that were deliberately obscured and dehumanized Africans as slaves. So we might think about the promise of genetic ancestry testing as it's being sort of in its early days in the molecular genetics research project of the African burial ground as being a project that would allow possibly a reversal of racialization. So the historian Michael Gomez says that what slavery did, what the Middle Passage did, was create race as a caste, as a social category, right? That the people who were trafficked here in the triangle slave trade were trafficked. Part of that trafficking was a transition from a socially stratified, ethnically based identity tied to a specific land and a specific identity to the concept of race. So what genetic ancestry testing offered in part was what the sociologist at Harvard, Mary Waters, called ethnic options, right? A kind of symbolic ethnicity that had been, in her words, highly constrained for African Americans, right? But had been available to Irish Americans, Scottish Americans, Italian Americans, right? But African Americans had been sort of trapped in this category of race. So Rick Kittles, the African American geneticist, leaves the African Burial Ground Project after he comes up with a system that would become his company, African Ancestry. So Kittles, who decides that he's going to try to analyze some of the remains at the African burial ground, and that he's going to create a reference database of known African genetic markers, genetic samples, and that he's going to take the few samples that they're able to get. This is in the 90s. It was very hard to get viable tissue samples. These were effectively ancient DNA samples. They were several hundred years old. And that he's going to match them against this reference database just to make some broad inferences, Gold Coast, West Africa, Southwest Africa, about where these people buried might be from. So this technique, the reference database matched against the samples, really becomes the engine of his company and the industry that we know as direct-to-consumer genetic testing. This is Kittles pictured with his business partner, Gina Page. He starts the company African Ancestry in 2002, and they based the company in Washington, D.C., or 2003, rather. So in 2003 in the United States, there are 4 direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry testing companies. Only one of them, African Ancestry, is Black-owned. Of these sort of founding 4 companies, only 2 still exist, African Ancestry and Family Tree DNA. So African Ancestry is a pioneering company in this sector in the United States, and it's also one of the more enduring. So by 2006, this company's tests had been featured on African American Lives. It had been in the USA Today, Good Morning America. It's widely successful. The company does Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA testing, which was sort of the very earliest kind of testing, and there's lots of more sophisticated testing now, exome testing, admixture testing that some of you might be familiar with. And this is just to suggest that what the Y chromosome and mitochondrial analysis testing does is the sort of, the mother's line and the father's line, and none of the testing in between. So given how kinship works in a place like the United States, it's very powerful to have a father's line, and given how a father's line often works with a last name, it can be quite genealogically powerful, even though it's a small percentage of one's actual DNA. So there are lots of caveats one might make about genetic ancestry testing. This is just a screenshot of a paper I did with some colleagues in Science, a small policy paper about the limits of genetic ancestry testing, which are technical limits, which are assumptions about creating social categories out of genetic markers, creating historical categories out of genetic markers that we can talk about. But moving ahead, what African ancestry offers is a certificate of ancestry, either based on Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA testing. And in this case, this person is inferred to be related to the Temne people of Sierra Leone. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 of the reconciliation projects I traced in my work, with the point being, again, that genetically inferred identity is not often the endpoint, that these genetic ancestry tests can be a catalyst for kinds of social action that I call reconciliation projects. And in the US context, they're projects of restoration, of recompense, and of reunion. In 2008, when I was still teaching at Yale, I received an email from a group of genealogists I'd been spending time with who call themselves DNA Sierra Leoneans. They invited me to attend a ceremony of commemoration that would take place outside of Charleston, South Carolina, on the banks of the Ashley River. They invited me to this Surah, as this commemoration of ceremony was called, and I attended with about 25 other people. So pictured here is the actor Isaiah Washington, who you'll recognize from Grey's Anatomy and other television shows and movies, who lays claim to being a DNA Sierra Leonean. The woman here is a member of the Polite family, which is one of the few African-American families that can trace their family to the continent of Africa using slave ship manifests. And this gentleman, her family traces to contemporary Sierra Leone. Her ancestor is a little girl named Priscilla, who was trafficked from Sierra Leone to the Carolina Low Countries. This gentleman is Amadou Masali, who was an immigrant from Sierra Leone to the United States, living in Dallas, who had flown to Charleston that day to be the kind of officiant of this ceremony of reunion of the African diaspora. So the ceremony takes place on the Ashley Ferry landing, which is pictured here, which is important in the history of slavery because it was known to be the site of at least 2 very large and important slave auctions, and also a point of disembarkment for slave ships. So Masali claimed that day to have soil from Sierra Leone that he cast into the Ashley River to rest the souls of his ancestors and of the ancestors of Isaiah Washington and the Polite family and others that were trafficked in the slave trade. He cast this soil into the river. This gentleman, also a DNA Sierra Leonean, said words and put a reef in the river. And this is Washington. It was a very poignant day. So part of what genetic ancestry testing allows is for individuals a reckoning with the history of slavery. And in this case, it took shape as a kind of pseudo-spiritual ceremony called the Surah. So I mentioned, discussing the African burial ground, that there were activists who were upset about the disposition of the remains. And there was a group of activists, cultural activists, who thought that the remains should not be disturbed at all. As soon as what they thought was a construction site was determined to be a burying ground, there were a group of activists who said these souls should be rested immediately. You should never disturb the dead. These were cultural activists who did 24-hour drumming vigils, candle vigils, and the like at the burial ground, demanding that their souls be left to rest. Among these activists was a woman named Farmar Pellman, who had there's a New York Times article in which she's interviewed, and she talks about being at the burial ground before it becomes a research site and seeing a construction backhoe bring up a grave and bring up a skull, and she felt like, she said, her ancestors were calling her to say something and to do something. So what she decides to do is to put herself through law school at the Brooklyn Law School in New York City. And she, within a few years, would come to be known as the Rosa Parks of the reparations litigation movement. She becomes the lead plaintiff in a class action suit for slavery reparations, a historic class action suit, Farmar Pellman versus Fleet Boston, which was the first time in over 150 years in which the cause of reparations had been tried to advance in a court of law. And this is a civil court case. This case was filed on behalf of her and 7 other plaintiffs against 21 multinational corporations said to exist today based on proceeds, on wealth that was made off of the slave trade. So industry companies like CSX, which was said to have wealth today from trafficking formerly enslaved people, Fleet Boston, Lloyd's of London, Aetna, and the like. So this is in 2002. By 2004, you won't be surprised to hear, here in Chicago, that an appellate court dismisses the suit on slavery reparations. The court says in January 2004 that the plaintiffs cannot establish a personal injury sufficient to confer standing by merely alleging a genealogical relationship to formerly enslaved Africans. So Farmar Pellman goes to the African Ancestry Company, right? The African Ancestry Company, which had started in 2003, so it's 1 year into its existence. She and one of the other plaintiffs go and purchase genetic ancestry tests that they want to use as an evidentiary retort to the court's claim that they're merely alleging that they have some relationship to formerly enslaved Africans. So the court rejects the claim, you won't be surprised to hear, and says that genetic mapping or DNA testing alone is insufficient to provide a decisive link to homeland. So genetic ancestry testing doesn't sort of advance the cause of reparations in any significant way, although it's a fascinating strategy used just a few years into a new industry. And we might say that what this case does do is pass the baton to Ta-Nehisi Coates, who a few years later would write this very important piece on making a case for reparations. So genetic ancestry testing also shows up in a new kind of diaspora politics in African American communities. This is Leon Sullivan, who was a Baptist preacher based in Philadelphia, pictured here with Martin Luther King Jr., was a civil rights era preacher, who was engaged in lots of other work. If you have taken a business ethics class, he's the person for whom the Sullivan principles are named. And Sullivan was a Baptist preacher, as preachers do, had messianic visions, and his vision was about diaspora. He said that he'd had a vision from God and from Africa to make a link and build a bridge between mostly African Americans and the continent of Africa. This took place in part through a series of summits called biennial summits called the Leon Sullivan Summits that were gatherings of effectively elites from the United States and on the African continent. These elites included former President Bill Clinton, who was an honorary chairman, board chair. These summits were attended by Condoleezza Rice, by George H.W. Bush, and lots of other American politicians, as well as African American political and business elites. So up until 2008, the people were were encouraged to do philanthropy, social development on the continent of Africa because they had a sort of sense that there should be work done in Africa. In 2008, the Leon Sullivan Foundation begins to encourage people of African descent to do DNA testing and to target or niche their philanthropy and their social development work, their economic development work on the continent of Africa based on genetic ancestry testing inferences. So you'll see here, this is from a screenshot from their summit, their 8th summit in 2008, which took place in Tanzania, that African Ancestry is the sponsor here for this work. So you have genetic ancestry testing, again, spinning out into this project, in this case, a project of kind of reunion and diaspora, and being more than about identity per se. The hope for outcome for many people, however, is something like what Isaiah Washington is able to accomplish, which is dual citizenship in Sierra Leone. So this is Washington's passport. It's a photograph I took, and I'm going to tell you where I took this photograph in just a moment. So he gets genetic ancestry testing in 2004, begins to identify as a DNA Sierra Leonean, starts to travel to Sierra Leone, and by 2010 has dual citizenship. So I took this photograph in Atlanta in a ballroom, and he was carrying in his breast pocket on this evening, and it was dog-eared. He'd only had it for a few months. And when I asked him why he was carrying his passport in the United States, he said these were his freedom papers, and he carried it wherever he went. So this occasion was the evening of my own reveal, of my own foray at the very end of my research into genetic ancestry testing. Isaiah Washington was the evening's MC. He's pictured here with the geneticist Rick Kittles, who I'd mentioned to you. Leon Sullivan, this is a Leon Sullivan Foundation event called an African Global Policy Forum, is pictured holding one of his many passports to the African continent. So I was part of an opening act. I did mitochondrial DNA testing and was inferred to be related to the Bamileke people of Cameroon. But the real reason that we were all there in this evening, about 300 people gathered in a large Atlanta ballroom, were for the DNA ancestry reveals of the son of Marcus Garvey, and the son of Martin Luther King Jr. This is Julius Garvey, a retired cardiac surgeon who is in his 70s, lives on Long Island, son of Marcus Garvey, very unassuming in his gray flannel suit with only his red, black, and green lapel pin giving a sort of sense of his father's Pan-African politics. Martin Luther King III, pictured here with his sister, that's Rick Kittles, Isaiah Washington, Gina Page, and Hope Masters, who's the daughter of the now deceased Leon Sullivan. So on this evening, both Garvey, the son, and Martin Luther King III learned that their patrilineal DNA traces to Europe. In the case of Garvey, to sort of Iberia and Spain, and the case of King III to sort of Ireland and other parts of Western Europe, and the maternal lineage traces to Africa in both cases. So this, for me, was another moment in which I realized that we thought these tests could do more than just do something around identity. This was a moment this evening, particularly with these two reveals, in which we see an attempt to play out the history, both the history and the future of the civil rights movement, of civil rights politics, through genetic ancestry testing. It was a moment in which we saw that DNA testing has wound its way into some of our more pressing issues around race and politics in American society. But it was a very kind of abstract racial politics, right? It had none of the specificity of Garvey's politics, which was about a kind of back to Africa Pan-Africanism that sort of proclaimed, lift up you mighty race. And nor did it have any of the sort of prophetic dreaming of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech or other of his works, nor any of the sort of class politics that would race his later life. This was really a kind of symbolic racial politics, a symbolic diaspora politics, but it's a kind of politics that suggests that race and DNA have reached a new moment in American society. Thank you.
We'll take a couple of questions if you'd like to raise your hand.
There's two in the back there. Yeah.
Come to you with the microphone.
Hi. Actually, good news. I know actually one of the mothers that disappeared, the one you showed, and she found her grandchild.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Most recently, about in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
I was in Buenos Aires when that happened, yeah.
But my question is, so what did one learn when they did the genetic history of venture?
A venture. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. I'm sorry. I forgot to say that. Yeah, I left you hanging, a cliffhanger. That wasn't by design. So, they didn't have enough remains. There weren't enough viable remains. His body had really sort of degraded. So that certainly in 2006, we weren't able to get anything that could be analyzed, amplified, or analyzed. So in the end, they learned nothing at all.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you. I enjoyed reading your book. I found it very interesting. But I had a couple questions of what do you think is going to happen to the social life in the African American community when the community learns about all the inconsistencies and all the errors and all the problems in Rick Kittles' databases, and why you didn't write about that?
I do write about that, actually. I do write about that. I mean, I write about so the community does know, actually, right? Because I write about quite a few people who use a bunch of different companies and get different results and try to negotiate what those results mean. And I don't know what we can say about the inaccuracies of any database because all the databases are proprietary. So anything that we can do to know what's accurate or not, and as consumers, with regards to these commercial direct-to-consumer companies, is only to sort of do our own kind of field experiment using lots of other companies. So there's not, I don't know how you can make a claim about a particular company's database.
Well, I'm not making a claim. I'm just talking about research that other population geneticists have done. And for example, you do put in your book the fact that Bruce Jackson and
the late now Dr. Bruce Jackson.
Yes, sadly.
Yeah.
Rick Kittles says that he has 200 ethnic groups in his database. And Bruce Jackson, as you write in your book, said there's 250 in Nigeria alone.
Yeah.
And there's thousands, on the African continent.
Sure.
And the fact that the Journal of Human Genetics says that you really can't tie African Americans to Africa because of the fact that it doesn't account for the historical migration across the African continent.
Well, but there are articles in the Journal of Human Genetics every day that are linking African Americans to Africa. So
not the way Kittles is doing it.
Yeah, I think so. The whole field of human genetics is about a reference database and matching it to samples and making assumptions using algorithms. And I think, part of what what's happening with Kittles and Jackson, that I'm writing about is that scientific laboratories and direct-to-consumer companies take scientific markers and make cultural and historical assumptions about them. Every single laboratory does that. Every single direct-to-consumer company makes that choice. And so, as consumers, you can decide which choice you think to you is more viable. But what is the case is that they're all creating social categories out of, a few nucleotides.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for reading my book.
Hi, just wondering, is there any kind of court of appeals are there any appeals going on in the cases that you cited where they denied the origin?
Yes, thank you. So the case is dismissed without prejudice, so there's a chance that they could bring a narrower case to the courts. But the evidence is always going to be a problem. Human genetics and direct-to-consumer genetics really operates on the level of population. It's not, this science has never really been interested in individuals. It's really about the aggregate. And if you think about big data and genome-wide association studies, as much as we are, on the clinical side, aiming to get to precision medicine, we're not terribly interested in individuals, right? And so the court case, because this is a civil case, is all about the liberal individual, is the agent in this case. And so there's a possibility, I don't know if the plaintiffs want to try with doing something like what is now possible since about 2008 with Ancestry.com, in which you can do, you can sort of begin to layer conventional genetic testing with genetic genealogy results. And you'll get sort of pings if you have matches with people. So there might be a way, it would still be quite difficult to accomplish, but there might be a way to go from the population to the individual and get closer to families and individuals. But then you would need that individual to be able to prove that they had an an ancestor that was trafficked by CSX, or a specific ancestor that was insured by Aetna. It's very much what the court really wanted was a more precise pedigree, both of going from an individual to an ancestor, and then from the ancestor being involved with a particular company and that company existing today. So it's pretty complicated, and it's a high bar, but probably not an impossible one.
Sure. Hi. So I'm involved in medical research.
Great.
And so in epidemiology, they've always been using self-reported information about race to categorize data on health conditions and outcomes, and then to understand the risks of relative risks among different ethnic groups. So recently there's been a move to switching from self-reported data about race and ethnicity to ancestry markers derived from these tests. And I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit on whether or not reparations and reconciliation should include trying to address health disparities in different communities, if there's been any move towards that, if anything like that is in the offing, as far as you can tell.
Yeah. I've been working with, my first book is about health disparities, and it's also about genetic disease. I write a lot about sickle cell anemia in the 1970s and the efforts of African American communities to do something about that. So, I think as we enter an age of, gene editing around particular diseases, I think that these things will come together. But it's complicated. I mean, I think that, there are some communities that understand access to certain kinds of diagnostics and technologies to be part of a civil rights enterprise, to be part of a civil rights struggle. And other communities, we might think about indigenous communities who want nothing to do with genetic analysis at all and genetic ancestry testing whatsoever. So, I think it's quite specific to community and to history in a way. And the other thing I would offer is that why I think I spent the first few years of my research trying to convince colleagues of mine who were medical geneticists, like why they should care about genetic ancestry testing, and they would be like, oh, that was my friend from graduate school, he's trying to make some money, it's not that interesting. What I would offer back to you is that for many of the people that I encountered, genetic ancestry testing is the first time that they ever think about genetics. So it's this kind of threshold into thinking about genetics at all that very much shapes how people come to understand or think about whether they're going to enter a genetic trial, a clinical trial, or whether they're going to, go and see a genetic counselor about disease and the like. And so, part of what I try to suggest about the social life of DNA is that how people think about genetic ancestry testing very much shapes their impressions and future experiences with medical genetics. Similarly, with genetics in the criminal justice system, this is a kind of minefield / kind of, social field of genetics happening all at once. And a lot of that is about disparity and repair.
Thank you very much. I really learned a lot from your presentation.
Thank you.
It made me think about a lot of things. Is this on?
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Oh, okay, sorry. One thing I wanted to say that's not really about DNA, but is what you said about Aetna made me think about it, and that's the whole controversy that's arisen from Georgetown University, realizing that they had slaves that they then sold to Louisiana, and they found the descendants of the slaves, and now there's a whole debate among the Georgetown community about what is appropriate, what should be done for those for the descendants, and so it's not quite the Aetna thing, but it is the issue of reparations.
Yes. So I'm just finishing an article on this as a kind of epilogue to my book, right? As we might think of this as a reconciliation project. Yes. So in 1838, Georgetown College, the Jesuits of Georgetown College sold 238 enslaved Africans from Maryland down to Louisiana to keep the institution afloat. beginning in 2001, universities like Yale, Brown, and later Georgetown in 2015 began to do some institutional soul searching around the history of slavery at their particular institutions. So Georgetown assigns a commission of a committee of alums, of scholars to look into this. And people knew about what are called the Georgetown 238, but it became a much more public and well-known historical moment in the history of Georgetown. A very interesting Italian-American alum who's been like a real muckraker at Georgetown named Richard Cellini, who comes up who appears in the archives in the New York Times and elsewhere in the 80s as an alum who's demanding that Georgetown open up the board of trustees and that it not just be a bunch of diocesan priests, that you have to have alums. So he's been really like, really sort of challenging Georgetown as an institution for a very long time, even though he's a very loyal alum. So this report comes out, and Cellini says, we can't just act like these people don't have families. Like, where are their families? Why can't we find them? So Cellini hires 8 genealogists with expertise in Louisiana to locate these families. They're using Ancestry.com testing. So they're using conventional and genetic genealogy, and they've located some of the descendants. So that's part of the reconciliation project. So what Georgetown does in part in response is to offer legacy admission to the descendants. So it says, you get a thumb on the scale, but they don't get any help with paying for the tuition or anything like that. So they do, it's a fascinating story. I mean, the president the very admirable president of Georgetown has gone to visit families of the descendant families. Georgetown had a big community mass. They had a big liturgy of reconciliation. And it was sort of after that, the descendants are coming together and they said, it's great that we've got legacy admission, but what about something more like reparations? And the demand is not for them as individuals. I mean, they're really, I haven't heard anybody saying, Georgetown should write me and my family a check, but they really do think that Georgetown is obligated to do something bigger that would be around a redistribution of resources to communities. Yeah.
Wow, it's the first time that did not work. I'm afraid, folks, we do have to conclude the program, though. But I do think it deserves a round of applause, eh?
Thank you.